Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation. More specifically, we're going to discuss the likelihood of a potential collapse. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So it should be of no surprise at this point to most of you that my general expectation is that the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation will continue to slowly go down. Now, it has been going down slowly for quite some time, but it could start to accelerate as we get further into the summer. And we've talked about this a lot. I've tried to do as good of a job as I can to prepare people for what I would consider to be the most likely outcome. Before we get too far into this, I do want to say that throughout this video, I will present plenty of evidence to suggest that the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation will go down a lot. With that said, there's no such thing as a sure thing in financial markets. Okay, so I can present all the evidence for something, and it doesn't mean that it has to play out. So I do want to at least acknowledge that to the people that would disagree with my point of view. Do know that even if we disagree, there's still a chance that the evidence does not actually, that it doesn't actually pan out. But I do want to explain why I still think that the drop of Ethereum Bitcoin has been going on and will likely continue to go on. Now, one of the things, a knee-jerk reaction to have to something like this is that, well, we've been talking about the collapse for a while now, right? And one of the things about the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation is it has been relatively resilient. We know that. Again, I will humbly point out that despite all of these moves to the upside by the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation, it should not detract from the idea that legitimately every single pump has just been nothing more than a lower high. Even this move here topped out at around 0.07093. And then the most recent one topped out at 0.07088. So even that one's a lower high, right? Even that one's a lower high compared to what came just a month or two ago. So there is this element of, hey, if the merge were so, were such a great thing for the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation, then why has it been putting in lower highs since September? Which, by the way, again, was a lower high when compared to December of 2021. So I still can't I can't remove myself from this obvious fact that I think a lot of people choose to ignore, and that is the fact that we have seen a series of lower highs since late 2021. The merge did not change anything. It has not changed anything. Now, one might say that the narrative, the tokenomics of Ethereum have changed things. I would argue they haven't changed much of anything in terms of the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation. Now, one reaction could be to say, well, Ben, it's mid 2023 and it's still sitting at 0.07. So what gives, right? What gives if this were 2018 or 2019, it would have already dropped. Well, a counterpoint to that is that there is so much excess liquidity that has just been taking a long time to shake out. Now, the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation has been going mostly sideways since May of 2021. You can very, very easily see this by just overlaying a 50-week moving average and seeing, in fact, that it has gone sideways here since April of 2022. I mean, obviously not sideways from here because it's going to take a while for the 50-week to get up there, but it's basically just been going sideways for a long time, okay? Now, even though the tokenomics of Ethereum, of course, changed, and we know that there's these deflationary aspects to it, we should remind ourselves that the Bitcoin dominance, right, the Bitcoin dominance, it just broke the range high. And again, the Bitcoin dominance is also concerned with the altcoin market too. It's not just Ethereum, it's also the stablecoin market. And so the Ethereum dominance hasn't really budged yet. It's still sitting at about 20 to 21%. So this excess liquidity from this cycle has taken much longer than it did last cycle, right? So last cycle, we were able to break the range high relatively quickly. This time, it has taken a much longer period to break it, arguably because of all the excess liquidity. So I think it would be premature to celebrate the sustained resilience of the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation as if it means that it won't drop at this stage. There is still a strong likelihood, that the Bitcoin dominance rally to 60% will be fueled by the collapse of the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation. One thing to consider is that the last time the dominance was at this level, or maybe slightly below, was in the summer of 22. The summer of 22. That was the last time the dominance was at this level. But what's interesting about that is when it was at this level, it was when the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation was all the way down here at around 0.05. So now we have the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation at 0.067, and the dominance of Bitcoin is already above where it was last summer. So my speculation is that now the range high is broken, just like it broke over here, just like it broke in 2019 as well. The fuel for it to go higher will largely come, or not maybe largely, it'll come from the altcoin market too, but I think a lot of it will in fact come from the devaluation of the Ether Bitcoin ratio. Okay, so yes, if you are a bull on the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation, you would clearly point towards its resilience. That is what you would point towards. And that's true, it has been resilient. But then again, there's a lot of altcoins that have been resilient. And I don't really consider ETH an alt, but there are a lot of altcoins that have been relatively resilient this cycle compared to the prior cycle. But we are still in a period of QT and higher interest rates and a slowing economy. And therefore, I do think that we will see a very similar outcome at the end of the day. One of the things that I wanted to mention is that there's several guiding moving averages that we can look towards. There is, of course, the bull market support band, which consists of the 20-week SMA and the 21-week EMA. You can see that really ever since January of 2023, the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation has been unable to get back above it in a sustained way. It did briefly happen back over here. It happened back over here. And then it also occurred back here. Now, we talked about this. We said, guys, it can pop above it, but if it just comes back down the following week, then it was a fake out, right? And if you zoom in here to the bull market support band for the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation, you can see that it actually closed below the 20-week SMA and the 21-week EMA for that matter. And so far this week has just been a continuation of that trend, right? It's just continuing to push lower. So as far as I can tell, all we've seen with the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation is a series of lower highs, at least in the short term. Now, I will remind you that over a longer period of time, we have seen a series of higher lows, but we've also had lower highs from 2017. So there's this element here of perhaps the time to consider a more likely bullish trend is somewhere down here. And maybe it's down here that we can then start to speculate about some type of recovery. But I still do think that this part is going to be a necessary component, whether you want to argue that the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation is an oscillator and it has to come back down here, or whether you want to argue that it'll eventually come back up this way. I think no matter what, it likely has to come back down in the short term before we figure out the ultimate trajectory of the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation. Another moving average that you can look towards, and this is something we spoke at length about a few years ago before the bull market began, is the 20-month SMA. So if you look at the 20-month moving average, you will see that once upon a time, we held support on the 20-month. And we sort of broke through the 20. The reason why it was important was because back in early 2020, we were watching how the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation kept coming up to the 20-month, but unable to break it. It finally broke it in July of 2020. Back tested it, and then off to the races. We got a monthly close below here, but just like with the bull market support band, it was a fake out. And we came back up, right? And then now we've started to get multiple monthly closes below the 20-month SMA, right? So over here, you had a breakout and then back test and then go. Now we have a breakdown, a back test, and then potentially go, right? So that is what I'm still looking at, is this idea that it's likely going to turn around. look at the 20-month moving average in general. I mean, you can see that there's some element of ebb and flow to this thing, and it looks like it's potentially about to roll back over again. So I do think that's another way that we can look at the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation. Another way to look at it is to go take a look at the daily candles and compare it to Bitcoin USD's distribution phase. If you go look at Bitcoin, many of you will likely remember how there was this period in 2021 where Bitcoin USD had this distribution phase in early 2021, right? You have 1, 2, 3, and 4. Ethereum's Bitcoin valuation had the same thing, right? You had 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then Bitcoin came back down, right? It retraced. It then went back up and got your little 1-2 punch for your last and final distribution phase before the actual downtrend began. The Ethereum Bitcoin valuation also had a very similar thing, right? Your little 1-2 punch in the secondary distribution phase. And ever since then, it has been down. Now with Bitcoin, remember, just because this trend started down, it wasn't clear that it was going to break this level until quite a long time later, right? I mean, we had to wait until the summer of 22 to actually see this break back to the downside. From this point, right, from this peak here to the actual breakdown, the first breakdown was about 183 days. If you look at the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation from this point here, it's been already 281 days. So it has been taking longer, admittedly, but I would still look at this and say, guys, this is still a downtrend, right? Like this is still very much a downtrend, right? Like Bitcoin USD had a downtrend, right? It wasn't straight down. It went down, back up, and then collapsed. The Ethereum Bitcoin valuation has done all sorts of stuff, right? I mean, it hasn't just gone down in a straight line. It is, let me actually draw a path on here so I can, it's been sort of all over the place, but every single time it ends up just slowly pushing lower. So I'm thinking that it's likely going to come back down to this range relatively soon, maybe bounce, and then get the final collapse down this way. So that's what I'm looking towards for the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation. Again, if you want to talk about the amount of time it's taking, it has taken longer than I thought it would. Might not happen, right? It might not happen, but it still does seem to be the most likely outcome. And if you wanted to take the other view and say that it's been bullish, then I would argue, how can you say that, considering that, again, it's just been a series of lower highs. So if it's so bullish, why is it a series of lower highs? Continuing on, another thing that we can look at are monthly Heikin-Ashi candles. So if you look at the monthly Heikin-Ashi candles of the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation, you will pretty clearly see, right, you have your initial move up, and then your first distribution phase, and then your second distribution phase, right? So you have your initial move up, and then your first distribution phase, and then your second distribution phase. Note that after the secondary distribution phase, we kind of hung around this level for a while. We had some red Heikin-Ashi candles, we had some green, but then once we got to July, we saw the collapse, right? Once we got to July. Now, we're still kind of hanging out up in this area, but I'm guessing within weeks, I don't know exactly when, right? But within a few weeks, I think it will also collapse in the same way. Okay? So you have several different moves here. And if we were to sort of draw a path, right, you have your first move, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Right? So doing that again for this cycle, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that's sort of the path that I think it will go, and it probably isn't going to bounce back up this high. Like if it bounces, it might do something like that. So drop as we get deeper into the summer, maybe bounce back up, and then the final collapse could come a little bit later. So I'm thinking it's going to look something like that. Now, one thing that we should remind ourselves of is of the tokenomics, because there is this idea of why are we looking at just the price valuations, considering that the supply can change, right? So perhaps a better way to look at this would be the ratio of the Ethereum market cap divided by the Bitcoin market cap. And this goes back to the idea that you'll see many people talk about, and that's the idea of the flippening. But I will say, the Ethereum hasn't really made any progress on that. In fact, the Ethereum Bitcoin market cap valuations were actually higher in 2018 than they really ever came during this most recent cycle. So if anything, I think you could argue that there hasn't been any progress by the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation or by Ethereum to flip Bitcoin from one cycle to another. Now, of course, there's been progress since 2019, but I'm not comparing it to 2019, right? We're comparing it to over here. One gotcha moment that I see a lot of people say is things like, well, this has been going up since 2019, and how can you call it bearish? I would like to remind you again, right, that I was very bullish on it throughout this entire phase. Okay, it wasn't really until over here that I finally said, hey, it should likely bleed back down, and it slowly has been, right? It very slowly has been, especially after we had the merge rally finalized. So I will remind you that just because you're bearish on something, over here, doesn't mean that you've always been bearish on it. It just means that, it's a markets change, and you should be allowed to change your mind. The other thing to look at here is that this is potentially an oscillator. And, we don't really have the data on this chart, at least going back to 2015, but I'm sure you can imagine it was probably a lot further. It was much further down than this, but you can imagine that it's sort of like an oscillator at as a potential outcome. I'm not saying that it has to go all the way back down to these levels, but it still would make me think that even if it doesn't go back all the way down here, it could it could retrace half of this move. So I'm still looking for that to play out. Okay. The other thing I wanted to mention is if you look at monthly candles for the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation, we talked about this before, we mentioned it many times in May, is that normally once you get into June, going through the rest of the year, the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation tends to bleed, meaning not every single month, but a lot of the months. In the pre-halving year of 2019, you'll note that in June, July, and August, we had double-digit losses every single month. Okay? We then had sort of like a brief break in September, and then we still continue to go down in October and December. That more or less marked a double bottom for the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation. So I still think that a majority of the rest of the year for the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation will in fact be red. Now the standard deviations on this of course are large, so you can see definitely there are some green months in the back half of the year, the back 7 months, but on average the first 5 months of the year tend to be green for the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation, and the last 7 tend to be red. And just visually looking at this, right, I mean you can look and see over here it's a lot more green, over here there's a lot more red. So from a seasonality perspective, I think we're entering into unfavorable times for the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation. And I would argue that, and as I said last month, I think that, that really the last stand will probably be in May, and then starting in June, we should start to see a larger correction take place. So far, it's only down about 2.5%, but I do think that could accelerate as we continue to push forward through the month and as we continue to push forward through the year. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that normally, when Bitcoin closes below its 20-week moving average, from weekly close below the 20-week moving average to weekly close above, the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation tends to underperform. So if we can pull up a chart here. So this is the chart. I need to make my video smaller so that you can see it all. So we're going to put me up there. And normally what this chart shows is like from when Bitcoin breaks down to when it breaks up, what happens. And so you can see that in 2016, when Bitcoin broke down to when it broke up, Bitcoin above the 20-week, Bitcoin had gone up 4%, Ethereum had dropped 10%, right? So this is a period here where Bitcoin went below the 20-week and Bitcoin outperformed. You can see that in February of 2018, break down until break up in March, Bitcoin went up 40%, Ethereum only went up 5.5%. Okay. March of, there's several here because there was a lot like, just back to back to back, but there was March of 2018 till July of 2018, Bitcoin went down 14%, Ethereum went down 35%. Breakdown in August of 2018 to March 2019, Bitcoin went down 43.5%, Ethereum went down 67%. Breakdown September 2019 until breakup of January 2020, Bitcoin went up 4%, Ethereum went down 4%. Breakdown March of 2020 until breakup in May, Bitcoin went up 11%, Ethereum only went up 5%. So what you're seeing is that every time Bitcoin breaks below it until it breaks back above it, Bitcoin tends to outperform Ethereum, right? Here, +1 to -7.5. Here, it was, so breakdown here, it was -5.3 for Bitcoin, -21.8 for ETH. Here, it was -50.4 for Bitcoin, -51 for ETH. I mean, it was mostly equal, but still technically Ethereum lost more. November 2022 until January 2023, what do we see? +28% for Bitcoin, +27% for Ethereum. Technically, well, it's more or less equal. Technically, Bitcoin had the lead. So what this shows is that 9 out of 9 times that Bitcoin broke below its 20-week moving average until it broke back above, Bitcoin outperformed Ethereum. Now, sometimes Bitcoin went down and Ethereum just went down a lot more. Sometimes, you might have saw Bitcoin actually go back up by the time it broke back through the 20-week SMA during that period if it had a large candle or something. But legitimately, 9, and we've had this table up for years. You might say, well, now that everyone knows. I don't know, guys. We've been talking about this table for the last 3 years? And so far, 9 out of 9 times, it has worked. Every time Bitcoin falls below its 20-week moving average on a weekly close, Bitcoin has outperformed Ethereum until we had a weekly close above. Now, the reverse tends to also be true, except for one potential scenario. And we talked about this. You can see that from break above the 20-week SMA by Bitcoin until break below, Ethereum tends to outperform Bitcoin, right? Here, October 2016 until February 5th, 2018. Bitcoin went up 1,161%. Ethereum went up a very modest 6,715%. If you look at breakup from March 2018 until March 12th of 2018, what happened? March 5th, March 12th, Bitcoin went down 17%. Ethereum only went down 16%. If you keep going with this idea, you will see time and time again how Bitcoin tends to underperform Ethereum when Bitcoin is above its 20-week moving average. Except, and we talked about this before as well, except for one time. That was in the pre-halving year of 2019. Bitcoin broke up. Bitcoin went up 106%. Ethereum only went up 29%. This is why we said in 2023 that even though Bitcoin's above the 20-week, a lot of people might assume that Ethereum will outperform Bitcoin. History shows us this is not a likely outcome, right? It says, look, in the pre-halving year, Bitcoin tends to lead because the dominance needs to go higher. Now, what happened? We just had the break up in January, and now we had the breakdown in June. Bitcoin went up 24%. Ethereum only went up 12%. So it was a fail in terms of above. It's now only worked 8 out of 10 times. But I would argue that it's not really a fail because this statement here should really be above it works if it's not a pre-halving year. So if you're to program it, right? Like if year is not the pre-halving year, then the expectation is that Ethereum outperforms Bitcoin when Bitcoin's above the 20-week SMA until weekly close below. But if it's the pre-halving year, then Bitcoin tends to outperform Ethereum, right? If it's the pre-halving year. And this is the pre-halving year. So you can see that it did not work. But that's not a failure of this indicator because we said it wasn't going to work going into it, more than likely. We said it's the pre-halving year. Bitcoin will likely outperform Ethereum. Okay? This is what we said many, many times. So I think that you can make the case that this actually worked out relatively well, and so far I would argue that the indicator has been very, very helpful. Another way to look at this too, is that if you go say look at things like ROI after cycle peak for not after cycle peak, year to date ROI is what I want to look at. Where is that one? It's right here. If you want to look at year to date ROI for Bitcoin, and you look at say 2019, you can see that Bitcoin ended the year positive, up about 2x off the yearly open. Ethereum, even though Bitcoin went up that year, Ethereum actually closed below the yearly open, right? Just below the yearly open. So there is this element of the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation tends to fade in the second half of the pre-halving year. So my expectation going into, as we continue to march forward through this year is that this will fade. Now, I mean, you can see a very similar area here, right? I mean, we had some red, and then we had a little bit of green, and then it finally rolled over, right? So we have this sort of phase here. I think that right now we're potentially right here, and we're on the cusp of a major breakdown by the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation. Of course, it could still take several weeks for it to play out, but I would still argue that fundamentally nothing has changed. And if you've been a bull on the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation, you still have to come to terms with the fact that it's just been lower highs. One of the brutal parts about bear markets for assets is that a lot of times you'll spend more time going up than going down. It's just that when you do go down, it goes down very quickly, right? So like you'll come in here and you'll move higher for so long, but it doesn't mean that it can't just completely take out that move extremely quickly. Okay, so please be aware of that, right? I mean, just like over here, we more or less trended higher. It didn't change the fact that despite the fact that we have all these trends higher, we eventually took out and put in a new local low compared to back in October of 2022. So if I had to draw a path for the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation, I would draw something like this, right? I'd say, all right, maybe it's going to hang out in here a little bit, but it likely will fall back down to this level here, maybe bounce back up and then fall to the 0.03 to 0.04 range, and then from that level I would assess, I would then start to assess like, okay, what's going on, what's the likelihood that this could be the low, or is it more bearish than that? But I still do remain bearish on the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation. I do think it needs to fall back down. Remember, once Bitcoin broke the range high in back over here, we moved up really quickly, and part of the reason that the dominance moved up a lot back then was because the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation started to collapse, because the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation back then essentially collapsed from around so here, I guess it was all the way down here, so it was around 0.058, and then it ended up collapsing all the way down to about 0.017. Now, I'm not saying it's going to go back down to 0.017, but I still do think that this breakout here was a very bearish sign for the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation, and it ultimately dropped a lot more as the months continued on. So I do think that that is a likely outcome as well, just looking at the Bitcoin dominance. Anyways, I think we'll wrap it up there. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium. Right now, the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation is coming in at 0.06723. So perhaps we will have to reassess this. We'll do some assessments before the end of the year, but once we get to the end of the year, 6 months from now, we'll come back and say, all right, well, did the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation drop? Did it drop? Like this, maybe? Or did it do something else? And I don't know yet. But I've tried to I've tried to lay out the evidence for why I think it's going down. And if you agree with it, great. If you disagree with it, great. Obviously, you have to make your own decisions. This, of course, is not financial advice. Anyways, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. I will see you next time. Bye.